May 1947, Hameln Prison, British-occupied Germany. A 27-year-old woman walks toward the gallows, her face pale but expressionless. In 15 minutes, she'll be dead, hanged by the neck until her body stops twitching. But here's what makes this execution different from all the others. This woman didn't just kill, she perfected the art of torture. She turned cruelty into a science. And when you hear what she did, when you understand the depths of her sadism, you'll realize why even hardened executioners called her death one of the most deserved in history. Her name was Dorothea Binz. And before we're done here, you're going to understand exactly why her final moments were so painful, why justice demanded she suffer, and why her story represents something darker than simple evil. This is about what happens when an ordinary person discovers they enjoy inflicting pain. And trust me, what you're about to hear will make you question everything you think you know about human nature. But here's what will really disturb you. Dorothea Binz wasn't born a monster. She was born in a small German village, the daughter of humble parents, a girl who dreamed of simple things. So what transformed this ordinary young woman into someone so sadistic that even Nazi officers found her methods excessive? The answer will chill you to your core. March 16, 1920. The small village of Düsterleck, Germany. A baby girl entered the world, and her parents named her Dorothea. Her father was a laborer. Her mother kept house. They were just another working-class German family trying to survive in the chaos after World War I. Young Dorothea grew up in real poverty, the kind where you go to bed hungry most nights. Germany in the 1920s was a nightmare of hyperinflation and desperation. And in small villages like Düsterleck, children like Dorothea learned early that the world was a cruel place. She was a quiet child, withdrawn. She didn't have many friends, and the ones she had, she dominated. Even at 8 years old, other children sensed something off about her. She was too intense, too controlling. School was a disaster. Teachers described her as difficult, sullen, uncooperative. At 14, she dropped out completely. For the next few years, Dorothea drifted through dead-end jobs, feeling the weight of a wasted life pressing down on her shoulders. Then Adolf Hitler came to power, and everything changed. January 1939. Dorothea was 19 years old, working another meaningless job, when she saw a recruitment notice. The SS needed women to work as guards at a new concentration camp. The pay was decent. The work promised authority, structure, purpose. She applied immediately. No hesitation. No moral qualms. And the SS accepted her without question. No psychological screening. They just needed warm bodies. May 1st, 1939. Dorothea Binz arrived at Ravensbrück concentration camp. This wasn't just any camp. Ravensbruck was specifically designed for women. By the time it was liberated, over 130,000 women would pass through its gates. Only 40,000 would survive. And Dorothea loved it from the first moment. Her training began under the camp's head wardress, a sadistic woman named Johanna Langefeld. The lessons were simple. Prisoners weren't human beings. Extract maximum work from them. Beat them if they slowed down. Kill them if they became useless. Never show mercy. Dorothea absorbed these lessons like a desert absorbing rain. For the first time in her miserable life, she had power. Real power. And something inside her, something dark that had been waiting her entire life, finally broke free. Within weeks, the other guards noticed something disturbing about the new recruit. Dorothea didn't just follow orders. She exceeded them. She innovated. She found new ways to inflict suffering that veteran guards had never considered. And most disturbing of all, she smiled while she did it. A smile of pure, genuine pleasure. The prisoners at Ravensbrück came from all over Nazi-occupied Europe. Political dissidents, resistance fighters, Jews. Any woman the Nazis deemed undesirable ended up here. And then they met Dorothea Binz. She was 20 years old when she conducted her first selection, deciding who would live and who would die. Prisoners lined up like cattle. If you looked too weak, you were selected for execution. If you looked sick, you were selected. If Dorothea simply didn't like your face, you were selected. She made these decisions casually, tapping her riding crop against her palm, sending women to their deaths without a second thought. But selections were just the beginning. What Dorothea truly enjoyed was hands-on torture. Her favorite weapon was a whip. Braided leather covered in cellophane so blood would wash off easily. She called it her pet and carried it everywhere. She used it constantly. On prisoners who worked too slowly. On prisoners who made eye contact. There didn't need to be a reason. Survivor testimony described how Binz would force prisoners to strip naked in the freezing cold, then beat them for hours, not in anger. As an experiment, she wanted to see how much pain a human body could endure before it broke completely. She took notes. She compared results. She treated torture like a science project. One of her favorite techniques was called the post. Prisoners' hands were tied behind their backs, then they were hoisted up by their wrists until their shoulders dislocated. They would hang there, screaming, sometimes for days. Dorothea would walk past them on her rounds, pausing to watch their agony, sometimes reaching up to spin them like grotesque ornaments. Survivors said she hummed while she did it. But wait until you hear about the water torture. This was Dorothea's own innovation. Prisoners would be forced to kneel in freezing water for hours, sometimes overnight. Hypothermia would set in. Some would die quietly, drowning. Others would survive but lose their legs to frostbite. Dorothea would watch the entire process, taking notes on how long it took for each prisoner to stop being human. The camp doctor conducted medical experiments on prisoners, deliberately infecting wounds with bacteria, breaking bones to practice surgical techniques, amputating limbs without anesthesia. And Dorothea volunteered to assist him, not because she was ordered to, because she wanted to watch. 74 Polish women were selected for these experiments. Dorothea helped hold them down as the doctor cut into them. And when the experiments were over, when these women were too damaged to work, Dorothea personally selected them for execution. By 1942, at just 22 years old, Dorothea had been promoted to head wardress. She was now responsible for training all new female guards at Ravensbrück. Think about that. This woman, who had found her calling in torture, was now teaching hundreds of other women how to brutalize prisoners. She was creating an army of sadists in her own image. Her training methods were hands-on. New guards would watch as Dorothea demonstrated proper beating techniques. The angle of the whip for maximum pain, how to pace a beating so the prisoner stayed conscious, how to read a prisoner's face to know when they were close to breaking. It was a masterclass in cruelty. The prisoners learned to fear her above all others. When Dorothea Binz walked through the camp, women would press themselves against the walls, trying to become invisible. If she looked at you, you were in danger. If she smiled at you, you were probably going to die. One survivor wrote about watching Binz beat a pregnant woman until she miscarried in the camp yard. The woman was 7 months pregnant. Binz knew this. She had specifically called the woman out because of her pregnancy. Then she beat her with a wooden club until the baby died. The woman died 3 days later, and Binz went to dinner like nothing had happened. Another survivor described how Binz would force elderly prisoners to perform exercises until they had heart attacks. These were women in their 60s and 70s, starved and sick. Binz would stand over them, whip in hand, screaming at them to move faster. When they collapsed, she'd beat them where they lay. But here's what truly reveals the depths of Dorothea's depravity. She didn't just torture adults, she tortured children. Ravensbrück held hundreds of children, and Dorothea showed them no mercy whatsoever. There are testimonies of her beating children as young as 5 years old. One survivor described watching Binz grab a crying toddler from its mother's arms and throw the child against a barrack wall. The child's skull cracked. It died within hours. She also took pleasure in separating children from their mothers. She would pick a child at random and drag it away while the mother screamed and begged. Sometimes she'd send the child to be executed. Sometimes she'd just hide the child, letting the mother suffer with uncertainty. Maximum suffering. That was always the goal. As the war turned against Germany, conditions at Ravensbrück deteriorated even further. More prisoners arrived every day. Food rations were cut to starvation levels. Disease ran rampant, and Dorothea's response was to increase the violence. More selections, more executions, more torture. It was as if she knew the end was coming and wanted to inflict as much damage as possible. In January 1945, as Soviet forces approached, the Nazis began evacuating Ravensbrück through death marches. Thousands of prisoners forced to walk hundreds of miles through snow and ice. Those who couldn't keep up were shot on the roadside. Dorothea volunteered to supervise one of these marches. Not because she was ordered to, because she wanted to. The march lasted 3 weeks. Nearly half the prisoners died. Dorothea personally shot dozens who fell behind. April 1945. The war was over. Nazi Germany had surrendered. Dorothea tried to hide. She discarded her SS uniform and attempted to blend into the flood of refugees. For a few weeks, she succeeded. But her victims remembered her face. Multiple survivors independently identified her to British authorities. May 3, 1945. British military police arrested Dorothea in Hamburg. She was living in a boarding house, working in a kitchen. When they came for her, she didn't resist. She just looked at them with those cold blue eyes and said, "I knew you'd come eventually." The British were building cases against all Ravensbrück personnel. They tracked down survivors, collected testimony. The picture that emerged of Dorothea Binz was damning beyond measure. Witness after witness described her cruelty, the innovations in torture, the pleasure she took in suffering, the children she'd killed. On December 3, 1946, the Ravensbrück trial began. 7 defendants sat in the dock, including Dorothea Binz. The charges were crimes against humanity, war crimes, and mass murder. The evidence was overwhelming. Survivor after survivor took the stand. They pointed at Dorothea. They described what she'd done to them, to their friends, to their families. They wept as they testified. They showed their scars. And through it all, Dorothea remained impassive. She showed no remorse, no shame, no recognition that she'd done anything wrong. When it was her turn to testify, Dorothea was calm and articulate. Yes, she'd been a guard. Yes, she'd disciplined prisoners. But everything she'd done was within the rules. The prisoners were enemies of the state. She was just doing her job, following orders, serving her country. She painted herself as a simple soldier caught up in events beyond her control. The prosecution tore her defense apart. They presented evidence of her initiatives, her innovations in cruelty. They showed that she went far beyond any orders. They proved she'd acted out of personal sadism, not military necessity. One moment stands out from the trial. A survivor named Rosa Jochmann testified about the day Binz had beaten her friend to death with a wooden stool for looking tired. As Rosa spoke, her voice breaking with emotion, Dorothea yawned. Actually yawned in the courtroom while listening to testimony about murder. The trial lasted 3 months, and on March 3, 1947, the verdict came down. Guilty on all counts. The tribunal found that Dorothea Binz had willfully and systematically murdered prisoners, that she'd exceeded any legitimate authority, that she'd acted with exceptional cruelty even by Nazi standards. And for these crimes, she was sentenced to death by hanging. When the sentence was read, Dorothea finally showed emotion. Not remorse, not fear, anger, pure rage. She stood up and screamed at the judges that they had no right to judge her. She'd been a loyal German. The prisoners were criminals. She'd done nothing wrong. It took 3 guards to drag her from the courtroom. In her cell awaiting execution, Dorothea refused to speak to the prison chaplain, refused any religious comfort. She spent her days pacing like a caged animal. In her twisted psychology, she was the victim. The world had betrayed her. Other prisoners reported hearing her scream at night, incoherent rage. She would pound on the walls until her hands bled. But here's what you need to understand about Dorothea Binz's execution. It wasn't going to be quick. The British executioners at Hameln, had a technique for war criminals. The standard method involved calculating the drop distance based on weight. Too long and the head could tear off. Too short and the prisoner would strangle slowly. For normal executions, the goal was instantaneous death through cervical fracture. But for war criminals, the executioner made adjustments. Not so much that it would be obvious, just enough that the drop wouldn't quite break the neck cleanly. Just enough that death would take a little longer. A minute, maybe two. Time enough for a final reckoning. May the 2nd, 1947. Execution day. Dorothea woke knowing what day it was. The guards reported she'd barely slept, just paced and muttered and occasionally laughed, a high, hysterical sound. At dawn, the guards came for her. She refused her final meal, refused to change into clean clothes. She wanted to go to the gallows in her prison uniform, defiant to the end. The walk from her cell to the execution chamber was 53 steps. Dorothea walked steadily, head up, eyes forward. She was 27 years old, young enough that she might have lived another 50 years. She'd chosen violence. Now violence was choosing her. The execution chamber was a converted barn, high ceilings, stone walls, and in the center, the gallows, a simple wooden platform with a trap door. Above it, the rope with its noose. Witnesses were present, British military officers, legal observers, a doctor, and one journalist. No survivors allowed. This was official business, not a spectacle. Dorothea was led onto the platform. The guards positioned her on the trap door. Standard procedure called for restraints on hands and legs to prevent struggling. The guards moved to restrain her, and that's when Dorothea broke. She started screaming, not words, just raw, animal sounds of terror and rage. She tried to fight the guards, tried to throw herself off the platform. It took 4 men to hold her while the restraints were applied. She was surprisingly strong, fueled by absolute panic. But the guards were experienced. They secured her efficiently. Dorothea continued screaming, her voice echoing off the walls. She was begging now, in German, in English, pleading for mercy, promising she'd do anything, claiming she was innocent, saying this was murder, not justice. The witnesses watched impassively. They'd read the trial transcripts. They knew what she'd done. Her screams meant nothing compared to the screams of her victims. The executioner approached with the hood. Dorothea fought it, jerking her head back and forth. But finally, the hood was secure. She stood on the trapdoor, hooded, bound, screaming into darkness. The executioner positioned the noose around her neck. The knot had to be placed precisely behind the left ear. When the trapdoor opened, the fall would force the knot forward and sideways, breaking the neck. Instant unconsciousness. Quick death. But remember the adjustment. The knot wasn't quite in the standard position, maybe an inch too far forward, not enough to be called improper, just enough to change what would happen when she dropped. The executioner stepped back. He checked that everyone was clear. He placed his hand on the lever. Dorothea was still screaming, her body twisting against the restraints, her terror absolute. This was the moment she'd spent 6 years inflicting on others. Now it belonged to her. He pulled the lever. The trapdoor opened. Dorothea dropped 8 feet. The rope snapped taut with a sound like a gunshot. Her body jerked. And then she didn't die. Not immediately. The misplaced knot meant the fall didn't break her neck cleanly. Instead, it crushed her larynx and began strangling her. She hung there, body convulsing, legs kicking despite the restraints, dying slowly by strangulation. The witnesses could see her body twisting on the rope. The doctor started timing, watch in hand. Protocol required confirmation of death. 1 minute passed. Dorothea was still moving. The movements were getting weaker, but she was still alive. Her body's systems were fighting desperately for air that would never come. Her brain was being starved of oxygen. 2 minutes. The movements had mostly stopped, just occasional twitches now. Her body swung slightly on the rope, turning slowly in a grotesque pirouette. 3 minutes. Complete stillness. But the doctor waited. Protocol required it. The heart could continue beating after respiration ceased. 5 minutes. The doctor approached the hanging body. He checked for a pulse. Nothing. He listened for a heartbeat. Nothing. Dorothea Binz was dead. The body was cut down and examined. The official cause of death was recorded as judicial hanging. The doctor noted extensive bruising around the neck consistent with strangulation. There was no mention of the misplaced knot, no commentary on why death had taken longer than standard. Dorothea's body was wrapped in canvas and buried in an unmarked grave in the prison grounds. No ceremony, no marker, just a hole in the ground and dirt piled on top. She simply ceased to exist, as thoroughly as she'd made her victims cease to exist. But here's what we need to understand about Dorothea Binz. She chose her path, not once, but every single day for 6 years. She chose cruelty over compassion, violence over mercy, power over humanity. Every morning she woke up and decided to be a monster. The Nazi ideology gave her permission. The camp system gave her opportunity. But the evil came from inside her. It was always there, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. The war didn't create her sadism. It just revealed it. This is the terrifying truth about people like Dorothea Binz. They walk among us. They look normal. They smile and laugh and blend in. But given the right circumstances, given permission and opportunity, they transform into something monstrous. And once they taste that power, once they feel what it's like to have complete control over another human being, they can't stop. Dorothea Binz died on that gallows, but the lessons of her life remain. We must remain vigilant against the ideologies that create monsters. We must recognize that evil doesn't always announce itself with horns and fangs. Sometimes it wears a pretty face and speaks softly. Sometimes it starts small. A casual cruelty here, a moment of unnecessary violence there, and grows into something unspeakable. The survivors of Ravensbruck never forgot Dorothea Binz. They carried her memory as a warning. This is what humans are capable of. This is what we must guard against in ourselves and others. Because the line between civilization and barbarism is thinner than we like to believe. And people like Dorothea prove that crossing that line is easier than we ever want to admit. Her execution brought no one back from the dead. It didn't heal the survivors' trauma. It didn't undo the years of suffering. But it did one thing. It proved that even in the darkest times, even when evil seems to have won, justice eventually catches up. It may take time, it may be imperfect, but it comes. And maybe that's the only comfort we can take from stories like this. That monsters can be stopped. That cruelty can be punished. That the arc of history, however slowly, bends toward justice. Dorothea Binz learned that lesson in her final moments, as the rope tightened and the darkness closed in. Justice delayed is not justice denied. It's just justice taking its time.